Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I hope you are all very well. My name is Lizzie and today I wanted to do something a bit different. I would like to discuss something that I've been thinking about recently, and this all started a couple of weeks ago. I was reading Cunning Women by Elizabeth Lee. Really enjoyed it. Great book. Full disclosure, I did have a review copy, but this is unrelated to that. And it got me thinking. I'm reading the book and it's a historical novel set in the years following the Pendle Hill witch trials. So it's the early 17th century. Women are being accused of witchcraft left, right and centre, basically for, having an opinion. That's where this book is set. And the tagline for the novel, I'm going to read it so it's exactly right. The tagline: Cunning Women, a feminist tale of forbidden love after the witch trials. And that's not just the tagline, that's the title on Goodreads. And I got to the end and I thought, I don't know if this was a piece of feminist literature. I don't know if I would call this a feminist book. It wasn't an anti-feminist book, but I don't know if I would call it a feminist book. So that got me thinking about how we define what is feminist fiction, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. I talked about this briefly on my Instagram story at the time when I was reading the book, and a couple of people replied sort of agreeing with my perspective, which on one level was nice because it's nice to have people agree with you, but also it would be great to have a wider discussion, I think, about what makes a feminist book. So that's what I'd like to talk about. To start us off, here is the Wikipedia definition of feminist literature. So this is what it says on Wikipedia. Feminist literature is fiction, non-fiction, drama or poetry which supports the feminist goals of defining, establishing and defending equal civil, political, economic and social rights for women. It often identifies women's roles as unequal to those of men, particularly as regarding status, privilege and power, and generally portrays the consequences to women, men, families, communities and societies as undesirable. So that's the very opening to the Wikipedia page on feminist literature. Now, as we all know, as we've all been told by every teacher we've ever had, Wikipedia is not a reliable resource. But I think in an instance like this, it's a good place to kind of go for your first definition. What does the collective agree? And by that definition, I don't think that Cunning Women is a feminist book. It is about women. It is about women who are oppressed, but that's not what the story is about. The story is about a teenage girl who is wanting to live a quiet life. And the story doesn't go about accomplishing that quiet life in a particularly political or radical way. The story was never about how the world is set up for her to have a harder life. The story was never about her and her suffering or overcoming the troubles that they face and the political and social reasons behind why women were in that position. It was just a story about a girl, which is great, but I don't know if I would call it feminist fiction. So then, what are some feminist fiction books? I've compiled a brief list that we're going to whiz through and just talk about why they are or aren't feminist fiction. So the first one, I think when we think feminist fiction, this is what comes to mind. The Handmaid's Tale. It's very obviously about the oppression of women. And you could argue that every book that centres women's stories, especially historical books or speculative fiction, automatically cover the oppression of women, unless it's in a utopia in which everyone is equal, in which case it's a feminist book for portraying that opposite to our current society. I think the difference with The Handmaid's Tale is that is the point of the story. The point of the story is to take all these things that have happened at various points in real life and portray them in a way that shocks us. So we read them and we go, this is terrible, this is awful, and then you look around the real world and you go, this is happening. And I think that's what makes it feminist fiction, the fact that the book's goal is to increase that understanding of how the law and politics and society can be used to control women, and how controlling women's bodies is often the go-to way of controlling women. The next book is one that you see on basically every list of feminist fiction recommendations, especially classics that are feminist, and that is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. And when I first thought of this for this video, I thought, that's really interesting, because if, in many ways, I wouldn't necessarily, my first thought is not that this is a groundbreaking, radically politically charged feminist book. But it was written a long time ago, and at the time it probably was. Little Women, following four sisters, is not just a case of documenting women's lives, but making a case for women having autonomy and having their own dreams and careers and being able to have that choice as to what they do with their lives. And it sparks off basically a whole genre of fiction, of sort of knockoff Little Women, essentially, in late 19th century American children's fiction, because it had such an impact on so many girls who read it and realised that they had more choices, or they were allowed to pick choices outside of the gender roles assigned to them. What I think is particularly interesting about Little Women, as opposed to a lot of the stories that came out around the same time, is there is no moral message, there is no moral judgment on any of the characters. Each woman has her choice that she makes because it's right for her, and we are never made to feel as readers that anyone is worse or better than the other. I think it's pretty obvious in the most recent film especially that those themes are so strong throughout the book. I mean, Jo is a feminist icon to so many girls and women throughout the last century and a half, or however long it's been since Little Women came out. If Little Women came out today, we probably wouldn't call it a feminist fiction, but it didn't come out today, and that's what makes it a feminist classic. The next one is, I think, a really obvious example of what feminist fiction is, and in many ways it's a sort of antithesis to The Handmaid's Tale, and that is Woman at the Edge of Time by Marge Piercy. And this is a science fiction book that imagines a futuristic utopia in which every single person on Earth is equal, and we care for the planet and look after the environment and each other and live these in these small communities where everyone supports each other and everyone has equal opportunity but also equal responsibility for each other. And this is a very interesting book. I would highly recommend it. And it's so clearly a feminist book in that, in order to create this utopia where everyone is equal, the book directly addresses the political and social and economic barriers that face women, and also the biological barriers that are one of the big cruxes of a lot of feminist arguments. I thought it was worth mentioning here because it's so cut and dry, this is a feminist book, that I think it's good to have an idea of, okay, this is feminist fiction with 2 capital Fs. This is what that is. The next one, I don't know how much I could call this feminist fiction, and that is Circe by Madeline Miller, which your first thought is, of course this is feminist fiction, of course it is. It's reclaiming the voice of Circe, and yes, that is all true, but does it accomplish any of those things on the original definition we had of feminist fiction? Does it address the political and social reasons for inequality? Not really. But just like with similar books like Pat Barker's Silence of the Girls and Women of Troy, it does tell the story of women who have been in male-led stories for literally thousands of years. So on that perspective, it's reclaiming that voice. But I still don't know if it's necessarily accomplishing the other things that were on the list. I think this one's in a bit of a grey area where it definitely has strong feminist themes and aligns with a lot of feminist ideas, but is it feminist fiction, capital F, feminist, capital F fiction? I don't know. The reason I bring up that book is, and I think this also applies to a lot of books that we think of as being feminist books, that telling a woman's story is not a politically feminist story. In that feminism is a social movement, and while telling women's stories contributes to that, of course it does, that's not what feminism is about. It's about equality as its pure and simplest statement, and how the world is set up to put those barriers in the way of women. And just telling someone's story contributes, but I don't know if that is in and of itself a feminist act as opposed to an empowering act. Feminism and girl power are slightly different things, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at here, you know? The last one in my sort of list of books to discuss is The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abi Dare. I read this one very recently, and I thought it would be a girl power book as opposed to a feminist book, that it would be the story of one girl finding her voice and finding her power. Great. I was really surprised that I felt it was also a feminist book, and an intersectionally feminist book at that, because as much as it was about empowering one girl and her finding her voice and her story, it was also about the mechanism by which she achieved that, and the barriers in her way, both literal and figurative barriers in her way, the financial resources she needed, the people that she needed around her, the importance of an education to changing her circumstances. Those are all things that are central to intersectional feminism. So of course this is absolutely an intersectional feminist book. But at first glance, I would not necessarily have called it a feminist book or a piece of feminist literature, even though that's absolutely what it is. We can all think of books or films or TV shows that have a female main character that are about telling a woman's story that we would never consider to be feminist. So what do we do with these books that aren't filling that definition of what is feminist literature, but we still feel like they have some of that empowerment and some of those goals in mind? I think there's a subtle difference between books where the purpose of the story is to promote feminist principles and ideals and ideas, and that is the goal of the story, is that those ideas will come across. Or is it a book about something else where the themes and the ideas align with feminist principles? I think it's a very subtle difference, but I think that's where the line is between feminist fiction and fiction that feminists will enjoy, which is where a lot of books fall into that camp that we call feminist books. They're books that feminists will enjoy, or rather books that are mostly enjoyed by people who would consider themselves to be a feminist. Books and any kind of fiction aren't feminist or anti-feminist. Those aren't the only two options. For a book to be feminist, it does have to fulfill that original definition. But just because it doesn't make it anti-feminist. It can just be. If a book aligns with feminist values, then often it's very easy to call it a feminist book, but I think we should be more careful about what we do call a feminist book. First of all, because then it can feel like we're holding a book to certain ideals, and we can feel let down if that book doesn't fulfill them. But that was never the purpose of the book in the first place. If we're being honest, a lot of books are labelled as feminist as a marketing tool, which is its own other whole thing that we can unpack. What that often means is that the people who enjoy this book will most likely be feminists. That doesn't necessarily make it a feminist book. Taking it back to where this started, to Cunning Women, I can see why it has been labelled as a feminist book. It's about women at a time when women were persecuted, and it does touch on a lot of themes that do align with those feminist values. It touches on the importance of consent and of financial stability and of the way that women's bodies have been controlled, and just the way that women are held to a different standard of men. But that's not what the book is about. That's just things that happen as a side effect of being a woman in the early 17th century. To not include those things would make this book historically inaccurate. So why has it been called feminist? Two things, I think. One is that, like I said, the people who enjoy this book are most likely going to consider themselves feminist. So it's a marketing tool to say, hey, if you read historical fiction and if you're a feminist, you will probably enjoy this book. And to be fair, they're right. The other thing, I think there's a very interesting link between feminism and witchcraft. There's a lot of people who consider those things to be the same. I don't, but I can see why people do. Witches, especially in real life witches, i.e. people who were persecuted for being witches, were often women who were financially independent and skilled and would be doctors and would have autonomy over their own lives. And so it's easy to identify with that when you're looking for something in the past to identify with. And we've all been guilty of it. I mean, I'm filming this on my phone with my Joan of Arc phone case. You know, we all have people or things in history that we look up to because we see them as being an inspiration for us. And I think for a lot of women, witchcraft is that, or witches of the past, or women who were accused of witches in the past. And I think a lot of women can see anti-feminism as being like a witch hunt and often literally call it a witch hunt. I will leave it to someone much more qualified, by which I mean literally have any qualifications in social sciences, to really investigate the types of feminists who identify more closely with witchcraft and witches and why that may be. I have my theories, but I will leave them be for now. So what was the point of all this? What was the point of me rambling on about what is and isn't feminist? Because there's a certain irony that it feels very, very gatekeepery for me to be here. Like, well, you can call this feminist, but you can't call this feminist, because that defeats the point of a lot of feminism. But it's not about saying that a certain kind of woman is wrong, or a certain kind of story is wrong, or a certain kind of fiction is wrong. That's absolutely not the case. For me, it's an interesting way that marketing has changed, but also the way that we're so eager to see something that is about a woman and call it feminist. Because that's just simply not true. And I think it can be very easy, especially for white feminists, to get feminism and girl power mixed up, to think that they're the same thing. But they're not. Feminism is about empowering women, but is so much more than going, you go girl, you've got this, you're a strong independent woman. That is definitely true and has its place, but so does addressing the social and economic reasons why women suffer more than men. It's about addressing patriarchy and why and how that affects our everyday lives. And it's about addressing how that affects different women differently. For me, calling these books feminist when they're not feminist fiction, it diminishes that, and it prioritizes that girl power approach and kind of leaves behind the intersectional approach that we need if we actually want equality. I don't think it's any secret that feminism and girl power have grown enormously in just a few decades in their popularity, in the way they're discussed in common culture, and that's great. And it's so easy for us to get them mixed up. But they are different things. And at the end of the day, it is a marketing tool. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has notebooks and pens and t-shirts and things that have slogans on that say things like girl power or this, that and the other. And, you know, that's a whole other capitalist patriarchal nightmare that we can discuss another day. And I think that's what books like this one and so many others are feeding into. And I think it's good to be discerning, to say this isn't a feminist book, but it does align with feminist values. That as a feminist, I'm going to read it and I'm going to agree with the moral stance of the book, if there is one. I'm going to see things I identify with. I'm going to see things that I think are important to discuss and to bring up. But also, it's about expectations. I went into this book expecting something much more politically minded, and I didn't get that. And obviously expectations aren't everything. We've all gone into a book expecting one thing, or gone into anything, a film, TV show, whatever it is. We've gone in expecting one thing, then it's turned out to be something different, and sometimes that doesn't matter. Sometimes we feel let down. And I don't think that was the case in this book. I don't think I felt let down by not having this more activist presence in the story. But there might be another book where I do. Someone else might have read this and been really disappointed by that. And that does affect the book's performance and its perception. I've definitely seen other people reading books where the cover says something along the lines of every feminist should read this, or every feminist will enjoy this book, or this is a must read for feminists. And then they've read it and there have been parts of the story that don't align with these feminist values and feminist ideas, and they felt let down and disappointed and given it a lower rating or worse review because of that, because they went in expecting something different. A book not being a feminist book doesn't make it a bad book. Like I said, the feminist and anti-feminist are not the only two places that it can be. We are seeing a political movement being used to sell things, and books are in no way alone in that regard. But I think it's important to bear in mind, and I think it's something that we as readers should be mindful of, but also that publishers need to find ways of being a bit more honest about what's in the book. There are so many books on there that are misadvertised and then suffer because of it. I don't think Cunning Women is one of them, but there are ones out there that do. It's important to recognise that feminism is so much more than individual empowerment. It's about a collective change from the ground up in the whole way that society worldwide is structured. We shouldn't lose sight of that. But also, reading books about women in history is great. And for many people, reading a book like this might be what brings them round to feminism, seeing a portrayal of women that they haven't seen before. And in that case, is it up to me or any of us to say this isn't a feminist book? At the end of the day, feminism isn't a genre. Going back to the books I discussed before, The Handmaid's Tale is speculative fiction. Woman at the Edge of Time is science fiction. The Girl with a Loud Voice is contemporary fiction. These books all have a genre, and feminism isn't it. Feminism is the driving force behind them. But is it up to me or to anyone else to decide what is or isn't a feminist book. I'm sure many of us have read books that wouldn't necessarily be called a feminist book that have increased our understanding of feminism. I'm not qualified to talk about this. I have a music degree. I read a lot of books and I think that I know things because I read books. And I would be really interested to know what you think, to have a discussion about it, about what is and isn't feminist fiction. Are you more likely to read a book if it says feminism on the front? What do you do if you read it and it doesn't live up to that expectation? Let me know in the comments. Let's have a discussion about feminist fiction, what it is. Can we even define it? Should we even define it? Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. This sort of video is why I made this channel. I wanted a place to discuss things that I'm thinking about that don't have a cut and dry black and white answer. And this seemed like the perfect thing to discuss in that regard. So please do tell me in the comments what your thoughts are on this. What would you define as being feminist fiction? Do you agree or disagree with anything that I've said? Let's have a respectful discussion about feminism in fiction. Thank you very, very much for watching. You can check the description for all of my other social medias and things. And I will see you next time. Bye!